Hello there, and welcome back. I hope you're all well. Eid Mubarak to everyone who celebrated, and it was also Shavuot last Sunday. Hag Sameach. I apologise for my awful pronunciation. Of course, with the conflict in Israel and Palestine once again dominating our news, ill-advised statements from people in the US and around the world, and endless proclamations with wildly different narratives, I thought I'd do a video explaining where the conflict comes from. Whilst I'd love to examine every single part of this in detail, we'd still be here a week from now, so this is going to be an overview with key points picked out as an introduction to the topic. Don't just rely on my word, use this as a guide to help direct your reading. This episode would not be possible without the contribution, advice and guidance of my good friend Rachel, who runs a podcast Hidden Wings and Bloodlust. She's got an episode coming out soon about biodiversity in the occupied territories, and I'm really looking forward to hearing it. The link is in the description. This narrative is contentious. Even the basic facts are often in dispute, with such a level of vitriol that I expect plenty of hate myself. I will brook no anti-Semitic hatred and no racism in my comment section. I normally don't delete comments and try to respond evenly, but I will be heavily moderating this time. Any anti-Semitic shit or racist crap is going to get deleted. So that aside, let's get into it. This video will seek to establish some much needed historical context, debunk a few myths, and then discuss the current conflict. The timestamps are in the description. We cannot discuss anything to do with Israel and Palestine if we don't first understand the ideological movement that underpins the creation of Israel in 1948. That is the ideology of Zionism and why Zionism exists. Since the breakage of ancient Israel in the Bronze Age, the Jewish population has spread throughout the world. Over the long millennia, that population has been subjected to horrific abuse, othering, violence, pogroms, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. They are without a doubt one of the most persecuted groups in history. It doesn't matter what theoretical rights they were conferred, many of those rights and guarantees were never upheld, and when they were, often arbitrarily revoked. This is not in any doubt. This is historical fact. It is without a doubt one of the saddest stories I've read when reading history, that a population are continually persecuted and unable to really lay down roots because constantly the populace are inflamed against them and then chase them away. From this stems the understandable desire to have a state of their own, a Jewish state of their own, where Jews can lay down roots and stay there, safe from persecution, with the guarantee that this state would never turn on them, because this would be a Jewish state. This is the root of Zionism, and this is one of the few times I agree with nationalism. The point of contention is, as it always has been, where this state would be. Throughout history, there have been several attempts and proposals at forming a Jewish state. Some with consent, some without. One notable attempt was to establish a Jewish city on the Niagara River in the 1820s. It's been speculated this inspired Joseph Smith on his move west to establish a home for the Mormons. Other attempts, such as a Jewish state in modern-day Uganda, failed because of its unsuitability. More forcible plans were explored by the Nazis and the fascists, where they would force Jews to either Madagascar or East Africa. These plans were also abandoned because logistically, neither could justify the resources it would require to relocate them when they could just exterminate them instead. And bear in mind, this relocation plan to dump the Jews in these countries was to do so without food, water or shelter, and was itself a genocidal plan. It was in no way better than what they eventually decided to do. One of the constants has been a desire to return to the ancestral homeland, which was in the 1880s under the control of the Ottoman Empire. During the first and second Aliyah, that is great migrations to the Holy Land, this was met in some places with welcome, in other places hostility. Both Aliyahs failed because many of the original migrants were from city-based European locations and were unable to adapt to the more rural life of Ottoman Palestine. The Ottoman Empire at that point was in a period of terminal decline, and so unable to really exert any territorial control over Palestine, barely wresting back control from Egypt. As the march to war gathered apace, the Ottomans fell on the side of the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary. This is not the Second World War, there were no good sides here. And as a result, the British Empire at the time, which was looking to widen support for the war amongst British Jews, met with Zionist organisations to negotiate the future of the Ottoman Empire should the Ottoman Empire lose. The negotiations were fierce between Zionists and anti-Zionists. The Guardian newspaper at the time had a very Zionist outlook and supported the plan strongly, believing the Palestinians were a lower form of culture and should be pushed out. This was not an uncommon viewpoint, and not a single Arab voice was invited to the consultation that became the Balfour Declaration in 1917, a commitment to establishing a Jewish homeland, but not necessarily a Jewish state, in the Holy Land. Immigration figures show that following the Balfour Declaration, there was a marked uptick in the percentage of Jewish immigration to occupied Palestine, that is, occupied by the Triple Entente at that point, until the Paris Peace Conferences and the Versailles Treaty, which partitioned the Ottoman Empire and created the British Mandate of Palestine. From the documents provided in the now declassified information and memoirs, it seems that the French wanted to claim Syria, Lebanon and Palestine for their own territory, justifying this naked empire building as long-standing cultural ties due to the Crusades. Yes, really. The British Empire wanted to protect the eastern flank of the Suez Canal and safeguard the oil resources from Basra, and so planned a railway from Basra to Suez, and the quickest route was through the desert, the Badia, a wasteland which would have quickly damaged the engines, and so an arced route that first went north towards Baghdad before curving back round towards Suez was envisaged. This would, however, encroach upon what would be French soil at this point. In the early parts of the First World War, the French and the British were losing trust in each other over respective territorial claims, so much so that it threatened the entire Entente alliance. The French government, realising they could not reasonably assimilate such a large area, instructed Picot, their negotiator, to withdraw French control up to Lebanon, which Picot did, with the added concession that Palestine would be an international zone. The British, seeking to create a buffer state here to safeguard the prospective railway, then turned towards the Zionists, which in turn led to the Balfour Declaration. As this was going on, due to the abject disaster at Gallipoli and the theological power of the Ottoman Sultan over the British Empire was becoming increasingly desperate to break the Ottomans. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed held the title of Caliph and was calling for a jihad against the Europeans who had colonised many areas with large Muslim populations. Some 100 million Muslims were subject of the British Empire alone at this point, with Muslim brigades present on all fronts. Such a revolt could not be permitted. To do this, they opened talks with Hussein bin Ali al-Hashimi, the Sharif of Mecca, who was claiming the title of King of the Arabs. As a recognised descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the Sharif had incredible authority and, according to British intelligence, a growing network of pan-Arab nationalists who wanted the creation of an independent Arab state stretching from Syria to Yemen. At first, the British did not take him seriously, believing that it was a negotiating ploy to extract concessions. But with intelligence coming forward to suggest the Sharif did in fact wield that authority and that network, negotiations continued apace. There is a significant dispute over whether the British went into that negotiation in good faith or not, especially as different parts of the Foreign Office were negotiating with Picot and the French at the same time to carve up Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan and Palestine between them. Nonetheless, the Sharif and his sons, believing that the agreement was in good faith, held up their end of the bargain, rising up to overthrow the Ottoman control of Arabia and the Holy Land. This is where a certain T.E. Lawrence, that is Lawrence of Arabia, steps in and is of great assistance to the Sharif and his sons in liberating Arabia, Palestine and even Damascus from Ottoman control. Under the conditions set, whatever the Arabs liberated, they would keep. Needless to say, these two conflicting promises were now on a collision course. There was no way to keep both promises, no way to honour these solemn pacts, especially as Britain wanted direct control of Transjordan and Palestine to secure the Basra-Suez route. Ultimately, Britain fell on the side of the Zionists because it helped undermine Woodrow Wilson's decolonisation agenda and better Zionist organisation in London. At Versailles, the British mandate was decided upon, as was the French mandate. The new Sharif, Emir Faisal, refused to accept this and refused to ratify the agreement, being quoted as, "How can I expect to affix my name to a treaty that sells Palestine and Syria to foreigners?" The British then withdrew their support from the Sharif, throwing it behind Ibn Saud, who conquered the Hijaz and created Saudi Arabia. Many of the problems with modern Islam stem from the alliance between Ibn Saud and the Wahhabi sect. The title of Caliph, claimed by the Sharif, did not get taken up again. This sets our scene and moves on to the interwar years of the British Mandate of Palestine. The British Empire reneged on the spirit of the Sharif-MacMahon correspondence and the Balfour Declaration, using vagaries intentionally written into both texts as a deliberate out to delivering on either. especially as Zionism turned out to be incredibly unpopular amongst Parliament and, it seems, the general public. Regardless of this, the sympathy of the officials in control of the mandate lay with Zionism. The first civilian High Commissioner, Herbert Samuel, was a Zionist, and the British administration refused to recognise the Palestinian Arab Congress made up of joint Muslim and Christian associations. The first Congress called on the British to honour the terms of the MacMahon-Sharif correspondence and keep Syria and Palestine together as a single independent nation. With the transfer of Syria to the French, this hope quickly evaporated, and the following Congresses attempted to assert their right to self-determination. The British Empire, despite reneging on the promise of an independent Jewish state, was still committed to establishing a Jewish homeland, and so at least early on attempted to facilitate this end. Throughout this early period, as the British mandate continued to disavow Arab attempts to gain representation and a voice at the table, riots began to erupt and more violent campaigners began to come to the fore. In the 1930s, an Arab insurgency arose which sought to kill Zionist settlers in the area, followed by the Arab Revolt in 1936, intermittently lasting until 1939, which erupted as a failure of the insurgency. The consequences of this revolt are still felt today. The British mandate banned weapons for all those who didn't have permits, but only issued permits for Jews, financially backed and armed the Haganah, Irgun and other Jewish militias, in effect giving them quasi-state authority over a majority Arab population that was in open revolt. Despite hyperbolic statements about the revolt being fascistic and Nazi, in the words of David Ben-Gurion, was pushed by fear of growing Jewish economic power, opposition to mass Jewish immigration, and fear of the English identification with Zionism. The economic and military consequences of this failed revolt terminally weakened the Arabs, kick-started effective Jewish control of the area through economic means, and crucially established a port at Tel Aviv and the key industries needed to independently manufacture arms, whilst weakening Arab manpower, ability to organise and, crucially, access to arms. The Arab Revolt of 36 to 39 is seldom cited and often ignored when cataloguing the history of anti-colonial revolts in today's academia. Indeed, European and American writing on this is almost as sparse as Israeli mentions of this period. In the middle of the revolt, during a lull in violence, the Peel Commission was established to try and broker a peace, but the Commission's conclusions were met with incredulity in the Arab world. It called for a partition that resulted in 80% of the already fertilised land that generated Palestine's chief export to a new independent Jewish state. Population transfers would be voluntary at first, but force would be used eventually. Over 250,000 Arabs would be expected to leave their land to areas transferred to Palestinian control, and just 1,250 Jews would be expected to do the same in reverse. Palestine itself would not be an independent state, but would instead be under a union with Transjordan. Even amongst Jewish organisations, this was bitterly divisive, with some such as Ben-Gurion urging acceptance as a way to establish a foothold before taking the entirety of Palestine for their own. Others wanted a more total approach that never allowed any Palestinian control of any territory in the mandate. As a result of the revolt and the rejection of the Peel Plan by the Palestinians, the British mandate began to limit Jewish immigration to Palestine to try and ease tensions. This was naturally unpopular, and as the Nazis began to persecute Jews in the build-up to war and the beginnings of the Holocaust, this became even more unpopular. The Yishuv, that's the early Jewish parliament, saw this as a betrayal of the mandate and the Balfour Declaration, and so began to facilitate illegal Jewish immigration. This caused further tensions, and Jewish terrorist groups such as the Lehi started to commit acts of terrorism against British officials and others as a way to force a change of policy, even assassinating a UN representative who saved Jews from concentration camps. The period where the Nazis were in the ascendance in North Africa, with Rommel leading the charge, was a period of great dread for Jews in the Mandate. If the Nazis successfully defeated the Allied forces in North Africa and took Suez, there was no real impediment to them invading the Mandate and exterminating Jews there too. This brought home to the Jews in the Mandate the necessity of establishing their own state. Once this threat faded, and the horrors of the extermination phase of the Holocaust started to become apparent, the Jewish terrorism campaign ramped up to force the British to first remove the immigration quotas and then get out of the way of the creation of a Jewish state. The urgency of this in Jewish minds after the Holocaust cannot be overstated. 1/3 of the global population of Jews was murdered. That's 2/3 of the entire Jewish population in Europe just gone. I cannot express the sheer horror of this. I cannot convey just the sheer scale of this, and I cannot in any way articulate just how much damage this is on a human level. I find it hard to read through these numbers, these accounts, and see pictures as I'm reading through the sources. After this, is it any surprise that Jews would want a state of their own? After this sheer inhuman brutality, is it any wonder that the survivors and other Jews would fight with everything they had to create a homeland where they would always be safe from this, where every Jew would always have a place to go if ever again they were threatened by something like the Nazis? This is why there is a reason for a Jewish state to exist. This is why the Jews in the immediate aftermath refused to accept anything except a Jewish state. This is why the Stern Gang, the Haganah, the Irgun and others began a terrorism campaign to force both the British and the Arabs out. And it was a terrorism campaign, from gunmen attacking hotels, to bombs, to kidnapping and murdering British police. Israeli terrorists armed by Free France pursued this campaign to push the British out and push the Arabs out. I obviously don't condone the violence, but I can understand it, just as much as I can understand why the Palestinians point blank refused to accept partition or giving up their home for what they saw as essentially foreigners. And bear in mind, the Arab Congress acceded to allowing Jews to live in peace and freedom with equal rights in an independent Palestinian state. But this was never going to be enough for Jews who wanted a homeland, and especially not after the Holocaust. So now we've reached 1947-8, the Palestinian-Israeli War and the founding of Israel. To Palestinians in the wider Arab world, this is known as the Nakba, the catastrophe in English. In Europe and the United States, this is a celebrated moment. It's a visual, visceral demonstration of just how differently a single event can be seen from different sides. To Israelis, to Europeans, to Americans, this is a celebrated moment as the moment for tolerance, as a moment for the promise of never again began to be fulfilled. To Palestinians, this is the horror of a rootless, stateless existence where their homes were taken from them as the world sat and applauded. In the end, the War of 47-8 wasn't much of one. Israel was armed and ready, with an experienced force from the Arab Revolt of 36. It had an industrial base that neither the Palestinians nor the surrounding Arab nations could match, and it showed. Despite the UN's partition plan, the Arab nations rejected it, attacked and were beaten back. This was a war for the nascent state of Israel's very existence, and I cannot undermine how significant this victory was for them. This war also led to the justification used today to deny Palestinian refugees and their descendants a right of return. The position of the Israeli government, and please bear in mind that the Israeli government does not represent Jews around the world or even all Israelis, is that these aren't refugees but emigrants, and that they left voluntarily. The problem is that research from Benny Morris, an Israeli historian, using the IDF's own figures, is that some 70% of the emptied villages residents left because of IDF, Irgun and other armed groups' actions. There are not readily available data on the other 30%. There are very few examples of Palestinians leaving because they were ordered to by the Palestinian or other organisations' orders or voluntarily leaving. This directly contradicts the position of the Israeli government and causes a significant issue regarding Israel's future, but that's a discussion for later on in the video. This was a period of great upheaval, and armed with British, American and French weapons, and supported by a strong industrial base compared to the surrounding states, Israel won the First Arab-Israeli War and annexed roughly 78% of the British Mandate, significantly reducing both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, which were occupied by Egypt and Jordan respectively. Though Israel had the military strength to push on and annex the entire area, Ben-Gurion ordered the IDF to stand down, recognizing that such a move would likely turn the great powers against them, which would significantly even the odds in any future conflict. Some 800,000 Jews lived in the Arab world prior to the 1948 foundation of Israel. One of the great tragedies of the founding of Israel is that almost all of these communities were steadily eradicated, either through pressure to emigrate to outright expulsion. From 1948 onwards, these communities steadily disappeared, and by the 1970s, they were all gone. through pressure to integrate when they arrived in Israel a rich tapestry of diverse Jewish communities that had stood for over 1,000 years in the Middle East disappeared, as did the rich language of Yiddish as Hebrew supplanted it. Interestingly, this is used as a counterpoint to the often made accusation that Israel is a colonial state. The Mizrahim Jews are Jews native to the Middle East since the breakage of ancient Israel and the beginning of a Jewish diaspora in the 8th century BCE. The claim is that the majority of Jews in Israel are Mizrahim Jews and therefore native. This means Israel cannot be a colonial state or foreigners put into the region or immigrants or anything but a native restoration. A statistical analysis carried out in 2009 suggests that 50.2% of Israelis are either of Sephardi or Mizrahi descent, with both groups having resided in the Middle East for several centuries at least. This is obviously tempered by the fact that Sephardi Jews applies to Jewish communities living as far away as Morocco, and even Mizrahi with a much narrower definition doesn't mean the same as native to Israel, just the larger geographical area of the Middle East. This is compounded by the fact that both Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews both moved from their respective native regions to others. The Sephardi Jews fled from Iberia during the Reconquista to the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, and other European countries. Many of these groups moved back to Israel following the foundation of Israel, which would still count as part of that 50.2%. We move on now to the Six-Day War, where Israel preemptively struck the Arab nations around them. As with absolutely everything to do with this conflict, it is shrouded in controversy and disagreement. The Straits of Tiran sits at the mouth of a Gulf of Aqaba, where the Gulf connects with the Red Sea. Eilat, which sits at the top of the Gulf of Aqaba, was seized by Israel during the First Arab-Israeli War in 1948. Some 90% of Israel's oil at the time passed through the Gulf of Tiran. Gamal Abdel Nasser, the dictator of Egypt at the time, had an alliance with Jordan and declared that the Gulf of Tiran was closed to Israeli vessels, mobilized troops at the border, and expelled UN peacekeepers. Israel, claiming that the Gulf of Tiran being closed constituted a casus belli, surprise attacked Egypt, destroying much of the Egyptian Air Force whilst it was still on the ground and unprepared. They then pushed Egyptian forces out of Gaza, Jordanian forces out of the West Bank, and when Syria joined the war, Syrian forces out of the Golan Heights. It was a humiliating defeat for all three, and they were caught completely on the hop against an aggressive Israeli force that was superbly prepared. After 6 days, an armistice was signed and Israel annexed or occupied territory formerly controlled by Egypt, Syria and Jordan. Israel to this day maintains this was justified as a preemptive strike against nations that were planning on attacking them. However, in private, it has been admitted that Nasser's troop movements were all defensive, that there was no indication of any attack coming, and all intelligence gathered by Mossad and the IDF seems to support this. Indeed, part of the reason the IDF was so successful is that neither Egypt nor Jordan were at all prepared to go to war. Abba Eban, the Israeli foreign minister during the war, wrote after it that Nasser had no intention of going to war. He wanted victory without violence. Military historians have written, irrespective of a legal nature, the IDF was spoiling for a war and did everything they could to get one. Further complicating this matter is the legal status of Egypt's initial moves over the Gulf of Tiran. Under the Geneva Convention, such a move would be illegal, but Egypt had not signed the Geneva Convention at this time. Do we consider a nation not signed to a treaty still bound to it? It's an interesting legal question. Complicating the matter even more is that Israel claimed to the UN and the outside world that they were the defending side and Egypt had attacked them first, something demonstrably false, and they later changed to they were defending themselves through a preemptive strike. Whatever the legalities, this fundamentally changed the nature of Israeli-Palestinian relations, as for the first time the Palestinians were truly at the mercy of Israel. This conflict was followed up by the Yom Kippur War, an attack by Egypt and Syria on Israel in an attempt to avenge the loss of the Six-Day War and restore lost territory. Initially, Israel suffered severe setbacks and despite approaching victory, took heavy casualties in the process. This drove home to Israeli politicians that they could not depend on perpetual military superiority. Despite the victory, it had come at a significant cost as the Arab nations were rapidly modernizing their industrial base and their military technology. Israel, because of its size disadvantage, depends upon keeping decades ahead of their enemies in terms of technology and strategy. When this gap closes, Israel is in serious danger. This gap has been steadily closing over the past few decades, and it is now only the threat of the United States that keeps other nations from gazumping them. Because of this highlighted vulnerability in the Yom Kippur War, Israel finally acceded to a peace process that would become the Camp David Accords. The Camp David Accords are one of the signature achievements of President Jimmy Carter. Previously to this, no real peace treaty existed between Egypt, the premier Arab power and presumptive leader of the Arab world, and Israel. The fate of the Palestinians was in flux, as with the territory that Israel now occupied in Lebanon, Syria and the Sinai Peninsula. Through tough negotiations but what seemed a genuine commitment to peace, Carter, President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin negotiated a framework that wasn't perfect but created an opportunity for peace. Israel would withdraw from the Sinai and commit to granting the Palestinians full autonomy in the West Bank and Gaza within 5 years. Israel interpreted these accords differently to the US and Egypt, which has since led to more conflict, with the focus now turning exclusively away from the conflict of countries to a focus on what is now called the Palestinian problem. That is, the interactions between the State of Israel and the Palestinians shorn of Jordanian and Egyptian protection. After many more years of stalls, such as the Madrid Peace Conference, we come to Rabin, Arafat and the Oslo Accords in 1993. The Oslo Accords were celebrated as simmering tensions began to rise as the failure of the Camp David Accords became apparent. With Israel still illegally occupying the Golan Heights and had not pulled back from either Gaza or the West Bank, and the founding of Hamas in 1986-7, yes, Hamas are a relatively recent development in this story, a new process was needed. Yitzhak Rabin taking a courageous step forward, and like him, Yasser Arafat, leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the de facto recognized government of the Palestinian territories of the time, negotiated in secret in Oslo to try and resolve long-standing issues. Jan Egeland, yes, that one. When this war is hell, sending Jan Egeland, the United Nations superhero man, was present as a facilitator and neutral party to try and assist the negotiations. The Oslo agreements were built upon the Camp David Accords and tried to use that framework as a guidance. The idea was to split the Palestinian territories into 3 areas, with progressive handovers from Israeli military government to an interim Palestinian government committed to elections. The Accords, however, allowed Israel to continue to deploy the military for protection of existing settlements, excluded Jerusalem, and gave Israel explicit continuing control over the air, land and sea borders. Since the signing of these Accords in the mid-90s, Israel has withdrawn from Hebron and Gaza fully by 2005, but has not withdrawn from anywhere else since. It is estimated that roughly 80% of Zone B and C, the West Bank and Jerusalem, remain under direct Israeli control. Despite nominal withdrawal from Gaza, Israel controls access in and out. Many perishable aid goods such as food, water and medical supplies sit at the border until they rot and before they're allowed in. This has happened frequently but intermittently over the past decade and is referred to as the Gaza Siege or the Gaza Blockade. Activists say this move, along with Israeli control over air, land and sea borders, renders Gaza into the world's largest open-air prison. A significant negative is that by splitting the Palestinian territories into zones, Israel has effectively fragmented the political integrity of the territories and thus fractured the PLO's ability to govern the region. That has had a double-edged sword effect, as they have found with Hamas. On one hand, it prevents the Palestinians from mounting effective political opposition as they had during the 80s and 90s under Arafat. But then, by fracturing that control, Israel makes it impossible for the PLO to prevent paramilitary organizations from firing rockets into Israel itself, the same way this occurred with Hamas in the late 2000s. Furthermore, the fragmentation of the zones effectively banned 60% of Palestinians from the West Bank, creating Palestinian enclaves whilst Israeli settlements claimed the land around them, before destroying the enclave itself, hence the continued hollowing out of the Palestinian territory and these maps. The agreements to revisit and finalise many of the accords was never truly realised. Rabin was assassinated with far-right Israelis, believing that Rabin had violated a covenant with God by giving away land that rightfully belonged to Israel. He accepted recognition of the PLO as a governing body, and Arafat lost a lot of ground for what was seen as unequal treatment. This added further dissolution between the various factions of the PLO and Hamas, which has led to the fragmented situation of today. Before I discuss a subsequent round of violence erupting over the past few weeks, let's discuss the key players today. We have the Israeli government, headed by Benjamin Netanyahu, who is a horrible right-wing person. This isn't in any doubt, and in fact his right-wing behaviour is what is causing the fracture between US-Israeli relations. He is also the only person to have mastered Israeli politics. In every way you could imagine, he is a masterful politician who has managed to retain power far longer than it should have been possible. Like many of the settler fringe, he seems to believe in an Israel that stretches from sea to river, the inverse of Hamas's river to the sea. This land is Israeli, it has always been and always will be, and the Palestinians must leave. It is remarkably convenient how often conflict seems to break out just when Netanyahu needs something for electoral purposes. Because of Israel's PR electoral system, a few extremist parties with 1 or 2 votes often rules the roost. You also have the settlers. The majority of these are ultra-Zionists and are the religious right-wing fringe of Israeli society. However, there are some who are dirt-poor Israelis who are told to live there by the Israeli government. The ultra-Zionists seek to transform the entirety of the Holy Land from sea to river into a Jewish state, and only a Jewish state. There is and will never be space for Christians or Muslims or any other faith. Israel is for the Jews, and always will only be for the Jews, because God gave them the land. Under this divine mandate, they seek to seize control of Palestinian land and will enact violence to get it. They constantly encroach and always seek to push further and further into recognised Palestinian land. Despite every single one of these settlements being illegal under international law, Israel continues and even accelerates settlement building at every opportunity. These settlements are protected by the IDF, and it is often around these settlements that violence so often erupts. Approaching these settlements as a Palestinian is gambling with your life, even if your home is where the settlement has just put up a fence. You have the Palestinian Authority, who are the municipal governing organisation of the West Bank enclaves, and nominally the Gaza Strip. And you have the Palestinian Liberation Organisation, which is a confederation of groups which represents Palestinians on the international stage. The PLO's biggest grouping is the political party Fatah, which is what Yasser Arafat used to lead. All three are used interchangeably when talking about the Palestinians, but of course, they're not the same. Adding to this confusion is Hamas, which is a theocratic political wing of the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam brigades, much in the vein of Sinn Féin and the IRA during the Troubles. The extent to which Hamas controls Gaza has been hotly disputed since the elections in the mid-2000s, following Israeli withdrawal, which gave Hamas a stonking majority. I want to talk about this a little more. Hamas ran on a platform of peace, of anti-corruption, dropping the Islamic agenda, and of seeking an agreement with Israel of no more attacks if Israel stopped attacking Palestinian villages and towns. Despite US funding of the PLO and Fatah, Hamas stormed to victory and immediately enacted their anti-corruption campaigns, quickly ending the gang violence that was erupting all over the Gaza Strip. Something seldom known is that in February of 2006, Hamas offered Israel a 10-year peace deal if Israel withdrew from the occupied territories. Israel refused. Hamas has contradictory ties with Iran, sometimes friendly, sometimes not. At the moment, Hamas and Iran are on the outs, following Hamas's actions during the Syrian civil war and their interactions with Daesh, also known as ISIS. Hamas's policy positions are often rather contradictory. They have often come to the table, such as the 6-month truce in 2008, where Hamas brutally enforced a ceasefire on their side so long as Israel upheld its end of the bargain. In the mid-2010s, Hamas amended their charter to remove the destruction of Israel as its stated aim and instead moved to secure Palestinian sovereignty. In 2017, they finally, after a decade of conflict, reconciled with Fatah and the PLO, which is helping solve the fragmentation that occurred after the Oslo Accords and the clashes over authority after the 2005-6 elections. Sometimes Hamas takes what is called Islamist positions, other times they decry those positions, even helping Egypt crack down on Islamic terrorist groups in the Sinai. It is contradictory, full of contrasting positions, and I doubt even Hamas understands what Hamas stands for. Lastly, you have the United States, which until the Obama presidency was from Truman onwards solidly, unrepentantly pro-Israel. For a multitude of reasons, the US saw Israel as its main strategic partner, with it often being said that Israel is a country-sized aircraft carrier for the US. The US provides billions in funding to Israel through direct funding and military hardware. In fact, Israel receives more of the United States aid budget than all of the African continent. The US often shields Israel from international action by vetoing sanctions and resolutions that threatens Israel's standing. Because of Netanyahu shifting rightwards, practically endorsing Romney, and then working so closely with Trump, turning support for Israel into a partisan issue, that alliance is now starting to fracture. The only thing holding back the Arab nations surrounding Israel is the threat of the US guarantee. If that guarantee evaporates, I would expect to see a brutal war between Israel, Turkey, and possibly Iran. Despite issuing nominal statements criticising the settlement program, successive US administrations have done very little to rein in Israel, often acting in concert and towing whatever line Israel pushed out. However, for the first time in this conflict, largely due to Palestinian social media pressure, the US is starting to change its full unqualified backing. This is not, however, going to change overnight, though it may just be that Biden is the last Democratic president to stand 100% behind Israel. The religious right of the United States, particularly evangelical groups, want a fully Jewish Israel because of the belief that doing so will result in the second coming of Christ and the rapture. To this end, they send billions in charity and send their kids to volunteer on farms and settlements, and will not countenance any presidential candidate that isn't 100% behind Israel. Let's talk terrorism, human shields, and the use of force. It's a thorny issue, and so often it depends on what side you fall on. The Israelis accuse Hamas of terrorism, as does most of Israel's allies, and whether it is or isn't terrorism is such a complicated issue. The general rub of it is that by firing rockets indiscriminately, Hamas is committing terrorism. Hamas's defenders will say that their rockets are closer to fireworks and are so old and without the modern technology used by modern armies that they fire rockets generally towards legitimate targets. UN rights groups, human rights groups, and supporters of a Palestinian cause will say that Hamas should stop firing rockets indiscriminately, but Hamas maintain that this is the price of occupation. So long as Gaza remains an open prison, they will make life difficult for the Israelis who refuse to allow them to live freely. I do not agree with Hamas's stance on this and abhor the idea of collective punishment, especially as Israel uses the exact same logic. There is also limited evidence that this is not popular among Palestinians, both in the West Bank and Gaza, though there is also evidence that suggests that if it is used to force Israel to end the blockade of Gaza, Gazans support it. Supporters of the Palestinian cause will call settler violence terrorism, and will call Israel's use of high explosive weapons on one of the densest places on the planet terrorism and collective punishment. Israel answers this charge by saying Hamas frequently uses schools, residential blocks, and other such places as operating bases to deliberately force the IDF into choosing to either kill civilians or allow Hamas to operate with impunity. Hamas has always denied the use of human shields, though it encourages its citizens to seek martyrdom. There is some evidence that Hamas does in fact use human shields, and also evidence against. Indeed, in this latest round of violence, Israel rolled out the usual excuse of human shields and said they'd produced evidence to the US when justifying destroying Al Jazeera's offices in Gaza. The US said they had seen no evidence of Hamas operating in the building, but quickly retracted that statement. Take that as you will. This is not the first time Israel has gotten itself into hot water over this issue, with the shelling of schools, UN facilities and medical camps over the decades. The default position is always that Hamas are using human shields. As I said before, there is limited evidence going both ways, but Hamas does encourage people to not leave their homes when the IDF phones to say they're going to strike the building. However, whether it is this or the belief that it is safer to stay indoors, as the IDF also hits targets in the streets when shelling or bombing the area, is in dispute. Furthermore, Israel has never had its evidence corroborated and is guilty of doctoring statements by Palestinian activists to try and build the human shields narrative. It is also worth mentioning that Israel has in the past deliberately targeted civilian populations and claimed that the warning to leave is sufficient, such as in the Operation Grapes of Wrath during the Israeli-Lebanese conflict in 1996, where Israel told the occupants of 88 villages to leave or endanger their own life. Israel then randomly targeted civilian households and destroyed them. Israel did not hide the fact that they did this to deliberately displace around 800,000 Lebanese citizens in the hope of prompting a humanitarian crisis. Such an act is illegal under international law, and I would ask, is this not also terrorism? If we are to call Hamas's firing of rockets indiscriminately without a care for who gets hurt terrorism, are we not also to call the IDF's use of force without care for who gets hit terrorism? I also find it worth noting that Israel was literally founded on the back of terrorism, and without it, the beleaguered British mandate would have lingered on. Especially when we factor in the casual use of force. Israeli snipers on their illegal separation barrier, which is built primarily on Palestinian land with a further exclusion zone that pushes further into the West Bank, have long fired at civilians without cause. Even when rubber bullets are used, they're used much in the way US police use them, firing directly at people rather than ricocheting them as they are supposed to be used. The Palestinians have also used suicide bombers to terrorise the Israeli populace, and whilst this is only a fraction of a Palestinian armed struggle, it is nevertheless completely unjustifiable and should be condemned by all as it routinely is. It's worth mentioning, however, that Israel classes throwing stones at tanks as terrorist violence and will shoot back with live guns, which I find utterly laughable. That a modern military force includes use of stone throwing as a legitimate pretext for violence should tell you everything about how use of force is justified in this conflict. UN groups, human rights groups, inside and outside of Israel have all stated that Israel uses indiscriminate force and does not care whether it hits civilians or not when bombarding Gaza. This has been seen increasingly over the past few days when, prior to the ceasefire announced at the time of writing, Israel shelled residential blocks, medical centres and even Gaza's only COVID testing facility. Let's now turn to the cause of this current round of the conflict. There are two primary causes. The violence over the last few weeks has been prompted by the potential destruction of the Sheikh Jarrah neighbourhood. Israel has a law that any Jew that can prove ownership pre-1948 is entitled to evict anyone on that land today. The idea underpinning the law is that anyone who is displaced by violence during the foundation of Israel can return to their homes. This law does not apply to Palestinians or Arab citizens of Israel. Settlers and Israeli nationalists have increasingly used records dating back to the Ottoman Empire, sometimes from the 1800s, to claim ownership without subsequent records, such as what happened to the Al-Kurdi family in the 2000s, where a bill of sale from the late 1800s. The Al-Kurdi family claimed this document was a forgery, and other Ottoman records show the land was only rented. The Israeli courts validated the bill of sale and refused to accept into evidence the document apparently showing the land was rented. Some Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah have said they would give up their homes if they can have their proven pre-1948 property back. Israel has always refused, saying that those homes were abandoned voluntarily. As Sheikh Jarrah is past the 1948 and 1967 borders and inside the Green Zone, it was abandoned by Jews in the Arab-Israeli War, with British officials urging Jews to evacuate at the outbreak of the war. Palestinian lawyers maintain that this land is legally classed as occupied territory and not Israeli territory. Israeli courts have no jurisdiction here, consequently making the evictions illegal. An expected court ruling on the evictions of 21 families was expected just a few weeks ago, but was postponed following protests. Israeli settlers and Palestinian families clashed all the way through Ramadan as Palestinian families held outdoor iftars, that is the meal that breaks the fast, as is often custom in the Arab world. Concurrently, it is also a habit in the Arab world for the call to prayer to be played over loudspeakers. Whilst this isn't common in Europe and the United States, it is analogous to ringing church bells. It is legal and acceptable within Middle Eastern and most Asian countries. The Israeli President Reuven Rivlin was due to give a speech at the Western Wall for Israel's Memorial Day, and Israeli authorities did not want the speech to be overshadowed by the Islamic call to prayer, especially as this was during the first day of Ramadan, and the call to prayer was seen as something special and important on that day. They therefore raided the Al-Aqsa mosque complex atop the temple compound, dispersing the crowds by launching stun grenades and firing rubber bullets indiscriminately. They cut the cables and blocked access to the Damascus Gate, one of the primary entrances for Palestinians in the occupied territories. They never requested to turn the volume down or not broadcast on loudspeakers or even postpone the speech. Violence was the first port of call. There is no doubt that this was a use of excessive and unnecessary force, and it is this incident combined with the legal actions around Sheikh Jarrah which sparked this violence and the global response. The very next day, in protest and defiance, 70,000 Palestinians crowded the top, and some began throwing rocks at Israeli police. The mosque administrators say that Israeli police again fired indiscriminately into the crowd in an attempt to clear the area so that a group of Israelis could visit. The Israeli police also fired into a medical clinic atop the mount. Protests and clashes continued unabated, with one video even showing far-right Israelis singing genocidal songs as a tree burned near the Al-Aqsa mosque. Widespread looting and violence began as Arab communities attacked Israeli residents and Israeli communities attacked Arab residents, setting cars on fire, beating random people and driving cars at crowds. The violence was indiscriminate and anyone who looked like the other side was in danger. Hamas issued an ultimatum to Israel saying that if they failed to remove their forces from the Al-Aqsa complex, then it would resume hostilities. Israel never responded, and so minutes after the deadline passed, Hamas started launching rockets from Gaza. The Israeli response was overwhelming, and for over a week they pounded Gaza with rockets, bombs and shells, inflicting heavy civilian casualties. Nearly 38,000 Palestinians have been displaced as a result of Israeli attacks. And I want to stress this, Hamas did not fire first. This time, as is provable and demonstrable, the Israelis attacked first. Though a ceasefire has now been agreed, it is hard to see how this doesn't escalate into future violence. Within hours, the Israeli forces made another incursion into the Al-Aqsa mosque, attacking Palestinians celebrating the ceasefire. As of the moment of recording, it is unclear whether the ceasefire will hold. The settlement building program has sped up again, and with Trump's approval of recognition of Jerusalem as the undivided capital of Israel, it has inflamed tensions once more. The viability of a sovereign Palestinian state is increasingly becoming doubtful as more and more land is stolen by Israelis in direct contravention of established international law. The Israeli government has been moving heaven and earth to try and conflate criticism of it with anti-Semitism, and this is causing a fracture worldwide. Jewish communities around the world take a very nuanced view, often leading the charge against the Israeli government and its unjustified violence, whilst also not wanting Israel's destruction. I say this because it is vital that everyone understands that this is a conflict with many sides, and unequivocal stances simply do not apply. I also wanted to emphasise this because anti-Semitic attacks and tropes have again reared their ugly head. Israel isn't Jews, Jews aren't Israel. If you're looking at your Jewish neighbours with suspicion or disgust because of this, stop, look in the mirror and have a good think, because you're being anti-Semitic. Because of the way that the situation is developing, unless there is a rapid change of direction, Israel will control the entirety of the West Bank and potentially Gaza. All of the Palestinians living there will then come under Israeli control but denied citizenship. If they don't ethnically cleanse them, Israel will have to make a choice, be a Jewish state or be a democracy. It will not be able to be both. Palestinian refugees are continually pushing for a right of return, and this will be part of any future peace deal. The logic is that if any Jew around the world qualifies for a right of return, then it is only fair that Palestinians who only a short while ago lived in the British Mandate have their right to return. This directly puts it in a conflict course with the identity of the Jewish state, and this is why I say Israel will need to choose between being a democracy or a Jewish state. Through a refusal to even make a token effort towards a two-state solution, Israel has recklessly allowed this situation to develop into one where people in Israel are talking about ethnic cleansing. It's also worth saying, and let me be absolutely clear on this, that those calling for Israelis to go home need to have a reality check. The majority of Israeli citizens who are descended from immigrants no longer have a home to go back to. An entire generation of Israelis born in Israel have lived and died without citizenship rights to any other country. Throwing them out will result in nothing more than another Nakba, and in my view would be an even greater crime because we know exactly what the results would be. The only solution here is to try and forge a true peace based on shared humanity. There will never be an absolution for the crimes, but we must try to move forward without forgetting, otherwise this cycle of violence will never end. To conclude, I would say this. Well, first let me apologise for the length of this. I did intend to keep it under 40 minutes. But yes, this conflict has rumbled on for over a century as a direct consequence of imperial games between the great powers of the day. It has been exacerbated by nations fighting proxy wars, by religious zealots and by strongmen who do not believe in giving an inch. Amidst all of this, innocent people have been caught in the storm of violence. It does not matter whose children they are. Any child cowering in a shelter or a room as bombs explode around them is horrific. Arab, Israeli, Jew, Muslim, Christian. Too many have died and too many have suffered, and it is time to pursue a true and lasting peace. This cannot be forged when hardliners on both sides continue to pour oil on the conflict, and whilst I cannot do anything about them, I can caution those who watch this video. Check your sources, try not to make unequivocal statements, be careful with your language, and do your best to remember that everyone is human, and we should try and make sure we recognise each other's humanity and the right to live without violence being part of our everyday lives. I'd also like to thank my Patreons and my first second tier patron, Livia, for her support. Thank you for listening. These are my thoughts. What are yours? Let me know in the comments section or on the Discord server. Thank you and goodbye.